It's a big moment for the PC Engine as we get our first third-party CD game. And somehow, it's a sequel. The Valis series is one of those nexuses that connects to a lot of things in the Japanese video game industry. And while the series didn't originate on the PC Engine, I think the PC Engine is where it gained its greatest notability. So we have to jump back a bit to understand it. The story really begins with a game design contest by Login Magazine. Nippon Telenet was already an established game company. Their game, Tsukuban Furuyo Densetsu, is lost. But we know it got attention from the judges because it was an action game that managed to do smooth scrolling on the PC-88. This was a very big deal, since doing smooth scrolling usually required some specialized graphics hardware, things that you might find in, say, a video game console, but not a computer at the time. When their bosses at Telenet found out what they had done, the group was split off to their own development team and told to turn it into a full game. That group took on the name Wolf Team, and they'd go on to do a lot of very big things. The game they made was given the title Mugen Senshi Valis, or The Phantasm Soldier Valis. It was an enormous hit on computers, and became one of those showpiece games for checking out how cool the graphics were. Because this was the height of the Famicom boom, the Famicom version was made, but it rebuilt the game from the ground up as something completely different. Then it became time to make a sequel. And for this sequel, Nihon Telenet took it away from Wolf Team and handed it off to a different internal team. But they decided to make another version alongside it specifically for consoles. And so there are two different Valis IIs, one for computers, one for game consoles. Okay, three if we want to count SD Valis, which is more closely related to the PC versions, but it's its own thing. We'll save that one for if I ever do the entire Mega Drive library. The Valis series was at the center of a movement in the late 80s that Japanese players called gal games. Games like Valis, Wonder Momo, and Athena got attention for the lovingly rendered depictions of their female main characters. So the term gal game came about to describe games that tried to use sex appeal to sell. This is one of those terms that gets thrown around, but not really pinned down. There's lots of debates over what is and what is not a gal game, and even exactly what gal games are. So you'll see people try to include or exclude things like dating sims or adult games. The PC Engine in particular got a reputation for being the home of gal games, perhaps partially driven by becoming the default platform for Valis games. So we'll be seeing a lot of gal games as I go through the PC Engine's library, though I doubt I'll be calling out many of them as gal games. Valis II had a relatively new concern for a game developer. At least two versions of the game were going to be fully voiced, so they had to find a cast. Telenet wound up holding a competition, searching for an actress who could play the main character Yuko, both in the game and in personal appearances. In the end, they chose Yuko Miyamoto. It was her first role, and Miyamoto has had a very long, pretty successful career. There are a lot of cutscenes in Valis II, and the introduction to every boss is fully voiced.
私の初めての友ありがとう
The acting is honestly not bad. Okay, really it's on about the same level as your typical kids cartoon in Japan at that point, but just compare it to this.
Yuko, you must see Varna.
That's Reiko's voice. I wonder if something's happened on Vakanji.
Hurry, Yuko. There's no time to waste.
That young woman single-handedly brought down the rogueless king. Is it possible that a mere woman now has the sword of Valis in her possession?
Yeah, Valis II had a US release, and believe it or not, it was the first CD-ROM game I ever played. So even though the voice acting was this,
Why does the Rogueless army want my Sword of Varus so badly?
There was a lot to be said for the novelty of having a video game talk to you. Unfortunately, that's novelty that wore off pretty quickly, as terrible voice acting became the norm for video games in the US throughout the 90s. And the English acting on PC Engine games tended to be especially bad. Valis II opens with a recap of Valis I. Yuko was your typical high school student who is granted vast mystical power by Varia, Queen of Vanity. Vanity's the name of the magic world. While fighting the forces of the evil demon king Logris, Yuko encounters her classmate Reiko, who has sided with the demons. Yuko kills Reiko in battle, and then after a heartfelt conversation, because it's one of those fatal wounds that lets you get out all of your backstory first, Yuko goes on to defeat Logris. With the backstory given, it turns out that Yuko is having the recap because Reiko's spirit is reaching out to her through Yuko's dreams. While searching for Reiko, Yuko is confronted by demons, and Yuko winds up meeting a dying Queen Varia, who lets Yuko know that Varia is her biological mother, and Yuko was taken to Earth to avoid a contest for the throne because Yuko has a twin sister. I wonder who that could be. Valis II is a side-scrolling action game played out across 6 stages. The first 5 stages are pretty long, and in the 6th and final stage, you ride a platform to the top. Yuko attacks with the Sword of Valis when you press button 2, but hitting enemies with the sword is the least effective way to use it. The sword fires some kind of ranged attack every time you swing it, and there's 4 different styles of sword attack. The sword is also upgraded by collecting a sword icon, which increases the power of the ranged attack, and sometimes changes it a bit. Sword upgrades apply to all of the ranged attacks, so if you switch to another one by collecting its icon, then you're still at the same power level. The maximum sword power level is 3, and Yuko goes back to level 1 when she dies. The first of the 4 sword attacks is a small shot, that's the default. Just a tiny little beam, and if you upgrade it all the way, it becomes a slightly bigger ball. The spread attack feels like it should be useful, since it fires both forward and upward at an angle, but not a lot of enemies come at you from that angle, so it winds up only being useful in a few places. The missiles are supposed to be homing shots, but I found them to not be especially good at that. They often ignore enemies and just go straight, and when they do swerve, they often miss as a result. It just makes the missiles really ineffective as a weapon. The final sword attack is the Crescent, and this is the best one. The Crescent destroys enemy shots. It also does the most damage. It also, when fully upgraded, becomes a wide shot. This has all of the advantages and none of the downsides. It's the power-up that you should be using. There are also 4 magic spells that Yuko can collect, and these come with a limited number of uses. You activate them by pressing up. That's it, just up. And that meant that I kept activating them accidentally due to the way I hold my controller. You have a limited number of uses for the magic, and it's very much a use it or lose it situation. The first spell is a star that orbits you. It'll damage enemies that come close, though it orbits fairly slow. At least you can activate it more than once, so you can have multiple stars going around you. Naturally, the hourglass is a time stopper, always handy, and the thunder destroys all enemies on the screen, except for bosses and mini-bosses, but even then it usually destroys their attacks. Finally, the icon that looks a bit like an explosion is actually invulnerability, and you can't go wrong with invulnerability. For other things that you can collect, hearts restore your health, and the blue hearts restore a lot more than the red ones. There are also the gems that give you points, and points let you earn extra lives. Valis II is a very easy game. It was halfway through level 4 before I lost a single life, and that was about 50 minutes into my recording session. When you die while running around on the stages, you'll go back a short distance, but if you die while fighting a boss, then you revive right in place and continue the battle. So the only thing that stopped me from beating Valis II while I was recording was just the fact that I ran out of time. You can save your progress if you get a game over, and that's saved to the internal memory of the CD-ROM unit, so you can power off the system and come back later, assuming you don't unplug the unit in between. While you're running around the vast levels, sometimes the screen scrolling will stop and a mini-boss will come out. In these cases, you just have to beat them up to continue. And when you reach the end of a stage, you get a warning that a huge battleship is approaching fast. The bosses all have a short conversation with Yuko, and then the fight begins. In terms of attack patterns, the bosses aren't too tough. They usually do one or two very simple things. The catch is, Yuko's not really that maneuverable. For bosses that run around, you have to jump perfectly to get over them, and her hitbox is larger than it seems, so you can often get hit by things that look like you can duck under them. However, the bosses are all kinda weak. If you go into a fight with a level 3 sword, you can usually outrace their damage. And if you happen to have the magic that makes you invulnerable, well, then the fight's over before it begins. As I mentioned, the PC Engine really becomes the home of the Valis series, so we're going to see a few more sequels, and then after those sequels, there's a PC Engine remake of the original Valis game. Not to mention the Valis Visual Collection, which I'll probably just shove into the Valis 1 video. As you might expect, Valis II is a beloved classic in Japan. One of those games that's cited as a reason people got the PC Engine CD module. My take is considerably less generous. While the music and presentation are great, actually playing the game is a slog. You pretty much have to play things slow because you've got such a narrow view, and they love throwing rapid charging enemies at you. At the points where the game starts to have some challenge, and by some I mean any at all, they just make the enemies take a ton of hits to destroy. And when I looked up strategies for mini-bosses and bosses, all of them were pretty much, yeah, you just have to soak up the hits. Valis 2 just isn't a very good action game, but they put a lot of stuff in it to make you overlook that.